The first time Margaret heard the words, her heart stopped. You won't get a penny. The sentence came like the slam of a judge's gavel, final and merciless. She had been standing in her own kitchen, her kitchen, the place where she had baked bread for 50 years, where the scent of cinnamon rolls still lingered in the woodwork when her eldest son, David, delivered the blow. His tone wasn't angry, not even cold. It was worse. It was detached, like he was reading from a script he had already rehearsed in his mind. Margaret's wrinkled hand tightened around the chipped porcelain teacup she held. The faint crack running down its side seemed suddenly symbolic, fragile, overlooked, but still holding together despite years of wear. Steam rose into the sunlight, filtering through the lace curtains, and for a moment she thought the words must have been imagined, but David's eyes told her otherwise. You've done enough, he continued, setting a stack of papers on the counter with deliberate care. The will's been changed. The house, the land, the accounts there under our names. Now, you'll be comfortable, of course, but you won't control things anymore. That word, control, echoed louder than the others. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. She glanced at her daughter-in-law Claire, who leaned against the doorway with arms folded across her chest, a faint smile playing on her lips. Claire didn't need to say a word. The triumph glittering in her eyes was enough. Outside, a cicada buzzed against the screen door. The Kansas summer heat pressed in, thick and heavy, but Margaret suddenly felt cold. She looked from the papers to her son, then back again. You think you can just take what I built? She asked softly, her voice trembling not from fear but from rage suppressed too long. Your father and I, David cut her off. Dad's gone, and you're not strong enough anymore to manage all of this. It's for your own good, Mom. You'll be taken care of. You won't have to worry. Margaret's mind reeled. She remembered the nights she and her late husband had stayed awake, counting every dollar, scrimping, saving, and planning. She remembered holding David's small hand as they deposited coins into the savings account that would eventually grow into the fortune they now treated like theirs by right. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Finally, Margaret let out a shaky laugh. It wasn't joyful, it was sharp, cutting, like glass against stone. You've forgotten something important. David, his brows knit together, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Margaret set the teacup down, steady now, her hands sure. You've forgotten who controls the bank account. Claire's smirk faltered. David opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure for the first time that morning. The papers on the counter looked less like proof and more like a bluff. Margaret rose from her chair slowly, deliberately, as though the years had melted away, and she was once again the woman who had run a household, a business, and a life with unflinching resolve. She stepped closer, close enough to see the nervous twitch in her son's jaw. You think this is over? She whispered, her eyes locking onto his. It hasn't even begun. The air in the kitchen shifted, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Claire straightened against the doorframe, her false confidence slipping just a little. Outside, the cicada stopped buzzing. Even nature seemed to hold its breath. What David and Claire didn't know, what they could never have anticipated, was that Margaret wasn't the frail, confused old woman they thought she was. She had spent decades learning every detail of the family finances, every account, every hidden safeguard her husband had put in place. And while they plotted behind her back, Margaret had been quietly preparing for this very moment. Like a general who knew one day betrayal would come. She thought of the safe hidden behind the false panel in the study, of the signatures and witnesses carefully arranged, of the account numbers only she knew, locked away in a memory sharper than any blade. Her late husband used to tease her about her need for control, but now, standing in her kitchen with her children turned adversaries, Margaret realized that need was the only thing keeping her empire intact, and she would not surrender. She turned back to her chair, sat down again, and took another sip of tea as though nothing had happened. Her calmness was unnerving. David shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a quick glance with Claire. You'll sign the papers, David said, but his voice lacked conviction now. It's already decided. Margaret smiled faintly, her lips barely moving. We'll see. The clock ticked again. Tick-tock, tick-tock, and in that rhythm, a silent countdown began, the countdown to a battle none of them were prepared for. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The words, "You won't get a penny," echoed in her head like a drumbeat. She lay in the old oak-framed bed she and her husband had shared for decades, staring at the ceiling, where shadows from the moonlight crawled like restless spirits. The house creaked around her, as though it too felt unsettled, aware that its future was being threatened. Her hands rested on the quilt she had stitched herself years ago, each patch a memory: the gingham from David's childhood shirts, the soft floral fabric from Claire's wedding dress hem, and even a square from her late husband's old work shirt. The quilt was a record of a life built and lived, piece by piece. And now, they wanted to strip it all away. Margaret sat up, her bones stiff but her mind sharp. She reached for the leather-bound journal in her nightstand drawer. It wasn't really a journal, it was her ledger. A handwritten record of every transaction, every investment, every move she and her husband had ever made. No one knew about it. To the family, she was just a sentimental old woman who baked pies and crocheted in her spare time. But Margaret had always been the quiet architect of their wealth. She flipped through the pages, running her fingers over the neat rows of numbers. There it was, the trust account her husband had set up in her name, the one no one else knew existed. There was the land deed tucked into the safe, signed in such a way that it could never be transferred without her consent. And there, buried in the meticulous entries, was her ace. She smiled faintly. They think they can corner me. They don't know who they're dealing with. The next morning, Margaret prepared breakfast as if nothing had changed. The smell of sizzling bacon filled the kitchen, mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee. When David and Claire came downstairs, they found her humming softly, her back to them. "Morning," she greeted, her voice calm, even cheerful. Claire narrowed her eyes. "You seem chipper." Margaret turned, spatula in hand, and smiled. "Why wouldn't I be? It's a beautiful day." David pulled out a chair, but his suspicion was palpable. He had expected tears, anger, maybe even begging. What he found instead was serenity, and that unsettled him more than any tantrum could. "About yesterday," he began. Margaret set a plate of bacon and eggs in front of him. "No need to bring it up again," she said. "I heard you loud and clear." Claire smirked, mistaking Margaret's composure for surrender. "Good. Then you'll sign the papers this week. We've already spoken to the lawyer." Margaret sipped her coffee, the cup steady in her hand. "We'll see." It was the same phrase she had said yesterday, but this time it carried weight like a warning hidden in politeness. David frowned, about to press the issue, but his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, muttered something about work, and excused himself. Claire followed, muttering about errands. Margaret watched them leave, her smile fading the second the door shut. She moved quickly, faster than anyone would expect from her age. In minutes, she had pulled the step stool into the study, climbed it carefully, and slid her hand against the wood panel above the bookshelf. With a practiced push, the hidden panel clicked open, revealing the small steel safe. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from exhilaration. She hadn't opened it in years. Her fingers twisted the dial, each number landing with a satisfying click. When the door swung open, she felt a rush of triumph. Inside lay the documents that truly mattered: the trust deed, the account statements, and a sealed letter her husband had written before he died. She hadn't read it in years, but tonight, she would. For now, she slipped the key papers into a manila envelope and tucked them under her arm. She would not go quietly. That afternoon, Margaret drove into town. The Kansas sun baked the fields golden, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. She passed the familiar landmarks: the grain silos, the red barn with its peeling paint, and the diner where her husband used to meet his friends. Everything seemed both eternal and fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it all. At the bank, the teller greeted her warmly. Everyone knew Margaret. She had been coming there for decades, and though the staff had changed, her reputation remained: sharp, reliable, and respected. "I need to make some changes," she said calmly, sliding the envelope across the counter. The teller nodded, glancing at the documents. Within minutes, Margaret was ushered into the manager's office. An hour later, when she walked out, the deed was reinforced. The accounts were locked tighter, and new provisions were added, provisions that ensured no one could touch her money without her explicit approval. She felt lighter, as though she had just fortified her fortress against an invading army. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, David confronted her again. "You went to the bank today," he said, his tone accusatory. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You've been keeping tabs on me." "I had to. You're acting different." She chuckled softly, the sound rich with irony. "Different? No, David. I'm just being myself again. You've mistaken kindness for weakness. That was your first mistake. Claire stepped in, her voice sharp. You can't fight this forever. You're old. We'll get what's ours eventually. Margaret's eyes hardened. What's yours? Or what you think you're entitled to? Let me be very clear, this family's fortune didn't appear out of thin air. It was built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And I was there for every single one of those moments. Don't you dare tell me what I owe you. The room fell silent. David shifted uncomfortably. Claire looked away. And in that silence, Margaret knew she had planted a seed of fear. Later that night, alone again in her room, Margaret finally opened her husband's sealed letter. His handwriting, neat and deliberate, leaped from the page. If you're reading this, it means the day I feared has come. I knew there would be attempts to take what we built. But remember, Margarita the strong one. You always were. Trust yourself. Protect what's ours. And never, ever let them see you break. Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it to her lips, and whispered, I won't let you down. Then she set it back into the safe and closed it with finality. The war had begun, and Margaret wasn't planning to lose. By the following week, the tension in the house had thickened into something you could almost touch. The air itself felt heavier, as though every word spoken carried a hidden weight. Margaret went about her days as usual, tending the garden, folding laundry, baking pies, but beneath the surface, she was orchestrating her moves like a chess master biding her time. She began leaving subtle clues. A stray envelope with bank documents accidentally left open on the kitchen table. A phone call taken in hushed tones, but just loud enough to be overheard. Each detail was carefully designed to stir unease in David and Claire, to make them wonder how much she truly controlled. It worked. One morning, Margaret noticed the way Claire's eyes darted toward her purse when she set it down on the counter. The younger woman's fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to search through it. David was no better. His attempts at casual conversation came with a nervous edge. His questions clumsy probes disguised as small talk. Did you ever think about simplifying your accounts, Mom? He asked one evening at dinner. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving his. Why would I do that? He shrugged, pretending nonchalance. Just easier to manage, I guess. You know, at your age. Her lips curved into a thin smile. I've managed just fine. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. What David and Claire didn't know was that Margaret had already begun visiting the family lawyer in town, Mr. Hensley, a gray-haired attorney who had served her and her late husband for decades. Listened carefully as she laid out her concerns. They think I'm weak, Margaret said, her voice steady, but I need to ensure they can touch what docentee belonged to them. Hensley leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. We can restructure the estate plan, make it ironclad. By the time they realize what's been done, it'll be too late. Margaret nodded. Good, do it. And so, while her children plotted, she countered with precision. New clauses were added, signatures verified, and everything filed under the radar. Margaret left the office that day with a quiet satisfaction burning in her chest. But trouble was brewing. One rainy afternoon, Margaret returned home to find her desk drawers rifled through, papers scattered. The safe in the study stood untouched, but the message was clear: someone had been searching. She stood in the doorway, gripping her umbrella, water dripping onto the rug. Her gaze swept the room, and though her pulse quickened, her face remained calm. Slowly, deliberately, she set the umbrella aside and began gathering the papers. When David walked in a few minutes later, his shirt damp from the rain, she didn't look up. Lose something? She asked coolly. He froze, guilt flashing across his face. I was just looking for the property tax receipts. Margaret stacked the papers neatly and finally met his eyes. Next time, asked. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. He left without another word. Margaret smiled faintly. She had him rattled. That night, the storm outside raged with thunder and lightning, but inside, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, knitting with deliberate calm. Every crack of thunder seemed to echo the battle unfolding within these walls. Claire stormed into the living room. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She snapped. Margaret glanced up, her needles clicking softly. Enjoying what? Playing games, making us jump through hoops. Margaret's smile didn't waver. I don't play games, dear. I simply live my life. If that unsettles you, Perhaps you should ask yourself why. Claire's face flushed with anger. You think you're clever, but you can't keep this up forever. The lawyer said. Margaret's knitting needles paused. The lawyer said what? Claire bit her lip, realizing she had said too much. Margaret's eyes glittered. So, you've already been making inquiries. How proactive of you. Claire spun on her heel and left, slamming the door behind her. Margaret resumed knitting. Her heart beat steady. Every outburst, every slip of the tongue from her children, gave her more information than they realized. The turning point came days later. Margaret received a letter in the mail, post-mobile from the bank. When she opened it, her hands tightened around the paper. It was a notification. David had attempted to gain access to one of her accounts using forged authorization. Her lips pressed into a thin line. So that's how far they're willing to go. That evening, at dinner, she laid the letter on the table between them. David's fork clattered onto his plate. Claire went pale. Care to explain this? Margaret asked, her tone deceptively mild. David stammered. That's not what it looks like. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Margaret replied, her voice sharp as steel. You've crossed the line. Claire jumped in, her voice trembling with desperation. We just don't want to be left with nothing. Mom, you've held on to everything so tightly. Margaret cut her off. Because I earned it. I protected it. And I must continue to, because my children are willing to steal from me. Her words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, David couldn't meet her gaze. That night, Margaret locked her documents away and sat at her desk, writing in her ledger by lamplight. Each number she recorded, each signature she planned, felt like another brick in the fortress she was building around herself. But beneath the calm exterior, her heart ached. These were her children, the ones she had fed, clothed, and cared for. And now, they were her adversaries. She paused, staring at the flickering lamplight. When did love turn into war? Yet even in the ache, there was resolve. She whispered to herself, if they want a battle, they'll get one. The storm outside had passed, but inside Margaret's heart, the war had only just begun. Margaret woke early the next morning, the house still cloaked in shadows. She moved with a quiet determination, her slippers whispering against the hardwood floors. The kettle whistled softly as she brewed tea, but her mind was already racing with the day's plan. She would no longer sit back and merely react. Now, she would act. Her first move was deceptively simple. She phoned the bank, her voice steady as she requested a temporary freeze on her accounts, not because she doubted her own security, but because she wanted to see how her children would react when the flow of money stopped. By mid-afternoon, the result came swiftly. Claire stormed into the kitchen, her voice sharp. The credit card was declined at the store. Do you know how humiliating that was? Margaret calmly stirred sugar into her tea. How unfortunate. Perhaps you should have carried cash. Claire's eyes blazed. Don't play coy. You shut it down, didn't you? Margaret's spoon clinked against the cup. I have no idea what you mean. Claire slammed her purse onto the table, lips trembling with fury. You're trying to make us suffer. Margaret met her gaze, unflinching. No, dear. I am teaching you something you should have learned a long time ago. Money is not a right, it's a responsibility. Claire stalked off, her heels clicking angrily against the floorboards. David, however, took a different approach. Later that evening, he appeared at Margaret's study door, his expression carefully composed. Mom, can we talk? Margaret looked up from her ledger. About what? He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Look, Claire's upset, but maybe there's a way we can work together. A compromise. Margaret folded her hands. Go on. David hesitated. You're getting older. Things happen. What if, instead of freezing us out, you let us help? Comanche accounts, for example. We could ensure everything's in order if I lose control. Margaret finished for him. David swallowed hard. That's not what I meant. But it's exactly what you're thinking, she said, her voice razor sharp. And you expect me to hand over control after you tried to forge access? You insult me, David, he faltered, his shoulders slumping. For once, he had no retort. Margaret leaned back, her eyes narrowing. If you want to prove you deserve responsibility, you'll have to do more than beg for it. What her children didn't realize was that Margaret had already begun constructing her next trap. She scheduled a meeting at the bank, not with her usual teller, but directly with the branch manager. The request was clear. Create a dummy account, seeded with just enough money to look valuable. but disconnected from her true estate. If anyone tries to access it, Margaret explained, I want to be notified immediately. The manager, intrigued by her cunning, agreed. Consider it done, Mrs. Langford. You'll know the moment someone takes the bait. Margaret left the bank with a sly satisfaction curling in her chest. The game was shifting in her favor. Days later, the bait was taken. The phone rang one evening. As Margaret prepared dinner, she picked it up, her heart steady. Mrs. Langford, the bank manager said, someone attempted to transfer funds from the new account you set up. We blocked it, of course. The attempt was made online from your home address. Margaret's eyes flickered toward the hallway, where muffled voices of David and Claire drifted from the living room. Thank you, she said softly. That's exactly what I needed to know. When she hung up, she lingered in the kitchen doorway, watching her children laugh over a TV show, as though nothing were amiss. The sound felt hollow, their laughter brittle. Inside, Margaret's resolve hardened. They'll take everything if I let them. The next confrontation came swiftly. Margaret gathered David and Claire in the dining room, the air tense with unspoken dread. She laid the bank's report on the table. Which of you did this? She asked. Neither answered. David shifted in his chair, and Claire stared at the tablecloth. Margaret's voice cut through the silence. Don't insult me with lies. The bank traced it directly here. One of you, or both of you, tried to steal. Finally, Claire blurted out, we were just desperate. You're leaving us with nothing, don't you see? We've sacrificed to. Margaret's tone sharpened. Sacrificed. You've lived under my roof, used my money, relied on me for everything, and now you call that sacrifice. David raised his hands, trying to calm things. Mom, we only did it because we're scared. You hold all the cards. What happens when you're gone? We'll be left with scraps. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes burning. Then maybe you should start building something of your own instead of clawing at what isn't yours. Her words landed like a hammer blow. That night, Margaret sat alone on the porch, the cicadas humming in the Kansas heat. She watched the horizon fade into darkness, her thoughts heavy. She had expected greed, even resentment. But what cut deepest was the realization that her children weren't just selfish, they were afraid. Afraid of a future without her. Fearful of being left behind. For a brief moment, sympathy stirred in her heart. She remembered David as a boy, clutching her hand at the county fair. Claire, as a girl, was crying when her kitten went missing. They had once depended on her love, not her bank account. But the memory only deepened the sting. Somewhere along the way, love had been replaced by entitlement. Margaret whispered into the night, if I have to stand alone, then so be it. Her decision was clear. She would outlast their schemes, even if it meant cutting them off entirely. The real twist, however, came the following morning. A knock at the door broke the quiet breakfast routine. Margaret opened it to find Mr. Hensley, the lawyer, his expression grim. Margaret, he said, stepping inside, we need to talk. Someone's been digging, not just at the bank, but at the courthouse. There are inquiries about your property deeds, your will, even your medical records. Margaret's blood ran cold. From whom? Hensley hesitated. The trail leads back to your children. But there's another layer. Someone else is helping them. A name I didn't expect. Margaret gripped the back of a chair, steadying herself. Who? Hensley's eyes darkened. Your late husband's brother, Uncle Raymond. He's been advising them, perhaps even funding their efforts. The room spun for a moment, and Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Her brother-in-law, the man who had once promised to look after the family. Now he was the hidden hand behind her children's betrayal. Her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. Then this isn't just about money anymore. This is war. The courthouse in Topeka stood tall and imposing, its limestone facade glowing under the pale Kansas sun. Margaret's cane tapped steadily against the tiled floor as she entered, Mr. Hensley at her side. The air smelled faintly of dust and polish, mingling with the low murmur of voices. She felt every eye turned toward her neighbors, curious onlookers, even familiar faces who whispered, she's the one being dragged to court by her own children. Margaret lifted her chin. Let them stare. At the front of the courtroom, David and Claire sat with Raymond. Their clothes were sharp, their postures rehearsed, but Margaret saw the tension in their hands, the flicker of guilt behind their eyes. Raymond, however, looked smug, as if victory had already been written. Ready? Mr. Hensley whispered. Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pulled into a bun, called the court to order. Papers rustled, the sound sharp in the hushed room. Raymond's lawyer rose first, painting a picture of Margaret as a frail old woman, confused, paranoid, and incapable of making sound financial decisions. He spoke with oily confidence, citing minor slips of memory, exaggerated anecdotes, and carefully chosen words from David and Claire. "She is no longer the capable matriarch she once was," the lawyer declared, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "Her children only wish to protect her from herself and preserve what remains of the family estate." Margaret's chest tightened. Each word was a knife. When it was her turn, she forced herself to stand, refusing the offer of her cane. She walked slowly to the witness stand, every step deliberate. Her hands trembled, but her eyes blazed with fire. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge began, "you may respond." Margaret drew a breath. "I built that estate with my husband. I balanced the ledgers by lantern light when we had nothing but debt and a dream. I raised those children with every ounce of strength in my bones, and now they claim I'm unfit, that I should be stripped of dignity and treated like a senile fool." Her voice wavered, but the room was silent. Even Raymond's smug grin faltered. She leaned forward, her gaze cutting into the judge's. "I may be old, Your Honor, but I am not weak. My mind is sharp, my memory is clear, and I know betrayal when I see it." Mr. Hensley rose next, presenting evidence Margaret had painstakingly gathered: bank statements, notarized documents, and even letters Raymond had written boasting of his plans. Piece by piece, the illusion of her incompetence crumbled. The judge's brow furrowed. "Mr. Raymond, it appears these documents suggest you had a personal financial interest in this petition. How do you respond?" Raymond shifted, his face tightening. "I was only guiding the children, guiding them into signing away their mother's rights." The judge cut in sharply. David dropped his gaze to the floor. Claire dabbed at her eyes, her composure cracking. For the first time, Margaret saw hesitation in their faces. Perhaps guilt, perhaps shame. The hearing stretched on, tension thick enough to choke. Margaret felt her strength waning, but she refused to sit until the end. At last, the judge raised her gavel. "This court finds no evidence of incompetence. The petition is dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking wood was like thunder in Margaret's chest. Relief washed over her, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. She had won, but victory came at a cost. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret turned toward David and Claire. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. "You chose his side over mine. You signed your names to lies." David's lips parted, but no words came. Claire whispered, "Mom, we just wanted what?" Margaret's voice cracked. "My money, my home. You could have had my love. That was worth more than anything in the bank, but you threw it away." The words hung heavy, and Margaret saw the regret on their faces. But regret could not rebuild trust once broken. Raymond stormed from the courtroom, his expression dark, his empire of deceit in ruins. Outside, the autumn wind whipped through the courthouse steps, carrying the faint smell of leaves and asphalt. Margaret paused, steadying herself with her cane. Mr. Hensley offered his arm, but she waved it off. "I'm fine," she said quietly. She looked up at the sky, vast, endless, unyielding. For the first time in months, she felt free. Her future was still uncertain. Her family was fractured, perhaps beyond repair. But one truth remained. She had fought back, and she had not been broken. Margaret whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "They forgot who controlled the account. But more than that, they forgot who I am." And with that, she turned toward the horizon, her cane tapping a steady rhythm, each step echoing with resilience. The morning after Mr. Hensley's revelation, Margaret lingered at the kitchen table, her untouched tea growing cold. Outside, the Kansas sky stretched wide and empty, but inside her chest, a storm churned. Uncle Raymond, the man who toasted her wedding, who carried her children on his shoulders at county picnics, who swore after her husband's funeral that he would always protect the family. And now, he was the shadow feeding their greed. Margaret pressed trembling fingers to her temple. The betrayal stung more deeply than her children's fumbling schemes. This was orchestrated, deliberate. Raymond was a man who knew her well, her habits, her vulnerabilities, her secrets. He would not make clumsy mistakes. He would come for her with precision. But Margaret was not defenseless. She picked up the phone and dialed Hensley. "We move everything, accounts, deeds, and the safe deposit box. Nothing stays where Raymond can sniff it out." The lawyer hesitated. "Margaret, that's drastic. It could trigger legal challenges." "Let them challenge," she snapped. "I'll fight them down." That afternoon, David and Claire returned from town, their laughter echoing in the foyer. Margaret studied them as they set down shopping bags, unaware that she knew of Raymond's involvement. "Did you enjoy your little spree?" she asked, her voice cool. David frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Margaret rose from her chair, her eyes hard as stone. "I know about Raymond." The air drained from the room. Claire's face went pale, her lips parting in shock. David tried to recover, but his voice faltered. "Mom, it's not what you think." Margaret's laugh was sharp. "Don't insult me again. You've been conspiring with him, digging through my records like thieves in the night. You thought I wouldn't find out." Claire shook her head, tears brimming. He said he could help us. We didn't know, Margaret thundered, or didn't care." Silence fell, thick and suffocating. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She walked through the house, each room carrying memories that ached like old wounds. Her husband's studies smelled faintly of cedar and pipe smoke. The nursery, long emptied, still held echoes of lullabies. Every corner of the house whispered of the years she had built this life brick by brick only for her children to treat it like spoils in a war. At the window, moonlight spilling over her lined face, Margaret whispered, "If Raymond wants a fight, he'll get one." The next day, she summoned him. Raymond arrived in his polished truck, stepping out with the same easy swagger he had carried all his life. His silver hair gleamed in the sun, his smile sharp. "Margaret," he greeted, as though nothing were amiss. "It's been too long." She stood on the porch, her arms folded. "Cut the pleasantries. Why are you meddling in my affairs?" Raymond's smile didn't falter. "Meddling? No, I'm helping. Your children came to me, frightened about the future. I couldn't just sit back, helping them steal." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. Raymond's eyes hardened. "I'm ensuring this family's legacy docentee rot away with you, clutching it until your last breath. You're stubborn, Margaret. You always were. But money sitting in accounts doesn't feed the next generation." Margaret's chin lifted. "And who decided you were the steward of this family?" "My husband trusted me, not you." "If he could see you now," Raymond stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If he could see you now, hoarding everything like a dragon, he'd say the same thing I am. Hand it over, Margaret, before you destroy what's left of this family." For a moment, her heart stuttered, but then steel returned to her spine. "Get off my property," Raymond smirked, tipping his hat as he turned away. "You'll change your mind, or the courts will change it for you." The threat lingered long after his truck disappeared down the road. By evening, Margaret sat with Mr. Hensley, drafting a new plan. "I want my will rewritten," she said, "effective immediately. If David and Claire continue down this path, they'll inherit nothing." Hensley studied her. "Are you certain? That's irreversible." "I've never been more certain," she said, her voice steady, but inside, her chest ached. Cutting them off meant severing the last fragile threads of family she had left. And yet, what choice remained? 3 nights later, the attack came not with violence, but with paper. A courier arrived at her door, delivering a thick envelope. Inside, legal documents, a petition filed by David and Claire, backed by Raymond, declaring Margaret unfit to manage her finances due to declining mental capacity. Her hands shook as she read the words. Each sentence was a dagger. They painted her as unstable, forgetful, a danger to herself, lies crafted with just enough truth to make them sting. Margaret's vision blurred, tears hot against her cheeks. Her children had signed their names at the bottom. She staggered to the porch, clutching the papers. The night air was heavy with crickets, but all she could hear was the echo of betrayal. "They want me gone," she whispered, but as the first wave of despair passed, a new fire ignited within her. No court, no brother-in-law, no ungrateful child would strip her of her dignity. She straightened, her frail frame seeming taller against the darkness. "If they want war," she said aloud, voice trembling but fierce, "then they've chosen the wrong opponent." The final line of defense would not be in banks or papers, but in the courtroom itself. Margaret would fight, not just for her money, but for her name. And deep down, she knew, the battle had only begun. The farmhouse stood quiet when Margaret returned, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the familiar wooden porch. The air smelled faintly of earth and drying hay, the kind of scent that had once wrapped her childhood in comfort. But today, the silence pressed heavy, broken only by the creak of the old screen door as she stepped inside. Her footsteps echoed against the worn floorboards. The house felt both familiar and foreign. Every corner held memories of laughter, arguments, birthday candles blown out, Christmas mornings filled with wrapping paper. Yet beneath those memories lay the sting of betrayal, and Margaret felt the contrast like a blade. She set her cane aside and lowered herself into her late husband's chair by the window. Dust motes danced in the golden light, and for a moment she simply breathed. She had won her case, she had kept her dignity, but the cost was high, and the wounds carved into her heart by her own children would not heal easily. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. The ticking of the wall clock filled the stillness. She picked up a pen and began to write, not to her lawyer, not to the bank, but to her children. David, Claire. The words came slowly at first, shaky, unsure, but then they flowed, her emotions spilling onto the page. You stood against me, and I may never understand why. Perhaps you were blinded by promises of security, or perhaps you thought you were saving me from myself, but what you did broke something fragile. Trust, once shattered, cannot simply be pieced back together. Her hand trembled, but she pressed on. Still, I am your mother, and though you hurt me, I cannot stop caring. My love remains, scarred but stubborn. I do not know if we can repair what's been damaged, but the door is not locked. If you truly wish to return, not for money, not for inheritance, but for family, then I will listen. Until then, I must guard what little strength I have left. Tears dotted the paper, blurring her script. She folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it on the counter. She wasn't sure if she would ever send it. In the weeks that followed, life resumed a strange rhythm. Margaret tended her small garden, the scent of tomatoes and marigolds clinging to her hands. She balanced her checkbook with precise care, each figure steady, unchallenged. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and warm words, their visits a quiet reminder that community endured even when family faltered. But there were moments, quiet evenings when the house felt too still, too empty. When grief gripped her, she would glance at framed photographs, remembering sticky-fingered hugs, childhood laughter, the bright eyes of her children before greed had clouded them, and she would wonder, was there still a way back? One chilly evening, as leaves tumbled across the yard, a knock echoed through the farmhouse. Margaret hesitated before answering. On the porch stood Claire, her eyes red, her coat too thin for the cold. She clutched a small paper bag as if it were a lifeline. "Mom," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. I'm sorry." Margaret's breath caught. She wanted to slam the door, to protect the fragile strength she had built, but something softer stirred within her. "Come inside," she said at last. The kettle whistled as they sat at the kitchen table. Claire slid the bag across. Inside was a jar of strawberry jam, Margaret's favorite, homemade just as she had taught her daughter years ago. "I don't expect forgiveness," Claire murmured, "but I don't want to lose you. Not for money. Not for anything." Margaret's throat tightened. She reached across the table, her hand resting on Claire's. For the first time since the betrayal, warmth seeped back into her chest. The road ahead was uncertain. David had not come. Raymond had vanished from their lives, leaving only the wreckage of his influence. Trust would take time, perhaps years, but that night, as mother and daughter sat in the quiet kitchen, sharing tea and broken words, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the scars would remain, but scars, she realized, were not just wounds, they were proof of survival. As she blew out the lamp and prepared for bed, Margaret looked once more at the envelope on the counter. She picked it up, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, "Maybe tomorrow." In the darkness of her room, Margaret lay awake, the wind rattling the farmhouse windows. She thought of the courtroom, of the betrayal, of the resilience that had carried her through, and she thought of the future not as a promise, but as a choice. Her voice was barely more than a breath. "They thought I was powerless. But I am still here. I am still me." And in that quiet declaration, Margaret found her ending, not in wealth, not in victory, but in the simple truth of endurance.